Okay, so today's notes are on cell processes. First off, some reminders. Pause and rewind whenever you need to. Write down all highlighted vocabulary. At the end, there's a Google form that you must fill out in order to complete the assignment. There are 5 questions. Most of them multiple choice. There's 1 checkbox. Just as a warning, there's 3 answers to that question, not 1. And then watch out for test question alerts. I will more than likely mention a few of them. So we started talking about cell organelles, and we focused on the cell membrane for the majority of last week. And if you'll remember, the cell membrane controls what goes in and out of cells. It's basically the border patrol. And the cell membrane is what's called selectively permeable. So selectively permeable means that some substances can cross the membrane and others can't. And usually it's related to their size. So smaller molecules like oxygen, water, salt can just cross the membrane without the cell having to expend any energy. Other substances can't. So we're talking sugar, protein, and other larger molecules like that. Proteins typically are very, very, very large molecules. So there are 2 types of transport. The first is called passive transport, and that's where we talk about diffusion and osmosis. Neither of those 2 require energy. So they're always transferring molecules that are smaller or small enough to fit through the cell membrane. Active transport does require energy, and that's when we need to transport a molecule that is larger, such as a sugar molecule or a protein molecule. And the 2 examples of that are exocytosis, where you're getting it out of the cell, and endocytosis, where you're bringing it in. All you need to remember is that active transport does require energy. That is definitely a test question alert. I'm definitely going to ask you what the difference is. So one does require energy, one does not. The first type of passive transport that we're going to focus on is diffusion, and that is the movement of substances from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So we're talking about oxygen molecules in a pond organism. So when we looked at and saw those one-celled organisms that were always too fast, like the glow bug, they would diffuse their oxygen. That's how they breathe. So through diffusion, the oxygen comes into their one cell and it goes out of their one cell. And so if there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the environment, or in this case on the microscope slide, the oxygen will go in. If there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the cell, the oxygen will go out. If we're talking about water, water has its own special type of passive transport. It's called osmosis. And that is the diffusion of water molecules across the selectively permeable membrane. It doesn't have to be a cell membrane. A lot of the times when we purify salt water, we're using what's called reverse osmosis. So we're taking the salt out of the water. And then water will move into and out of a cell constantly. It works the same way. If there's a higher concentration of water outside the cell, then it will go in. If there's a higher concentration inside the cell, then the water will move out. Active transport, as I said before, requires energy, and that's the movement of materials that cannot pass through the membrane, such as sugar, usually because they're way too big, and it requires the cell to use energy. During active transport, the cell membrane actually has to change shape and engulf the particle. So if we're talking about food, such as sugar, or we're talking about a pathogen, which of course you don't want to get in the cell, but that's one of them, or we're talking protein molecules, they need to change the shape, and that requires the cell to use energy. And that's all I have for you today.